1. The Ascendance of the Chinese Mestizo. This section presents the significant roles of Chinese mestizos in Philippine history, governance, and economy. It also shows how the Chinese mestizos influenced the character of Rizal, who has Chinese roots.
The Chinese history in the Philippines. Chinese settlers arrived in the Philippines as early as the 16th century. Some historians believe that the Chinese originally arrived in the Philippines as merchants between the ports of Manila and China during the pre-colonial period. However, Chinese immigration did not become dominant in the Philippine society until the Spanish colonial period. Binondo was established in the year 1594 by the Spanish governor Luis Perez Dasmariñas as a permanent community for Chinese mestizos who had converted to Catholicism. Merchants and traders were free to conduct business in this section of Manila, known as Binondo. Binondo also became a hub for intermarriages between Chinese immigrants and native Filipinos, thus the emergence of the Chinese mestizos. The Spaniards considered the growing Chinese population as a danger to their own control. The Chinese, unlike the Indios, were thought to be significantly less loyal to the Spanish rule. Nonetheless, the Spaniards could not ignore the reality that the Chinese played an important role to their colonial rule since they provided Manila with valuable capital. Despite instructions to remove all Chinese from the Philippines, Governor Dasmariñas recognized the importance of the Chinese to Manila economy.
Chinese mestizo communities aside from Binondo emerged in many other parts of the archipelago. In Manila, notable communities were Santa Cruz and Tondo. In the early 17th century, more than 100 Chinese individuals were married to native Filipinos in Iloilo, Pampanga, and Cebu. In northern Luzon, Chinese mestizos could be found in Pangasinan, Benguet, and Mountain Province. From the beginning of the Spanish colonial period until 1740, the inhabitants of the Philippines were classified into three: Spaniards, Indios, and Chinese. As the Chinese mestizo population grew, questions regarding their legal status as inhabitants of the country arose. It was only in 1741 that their legal status was officially established, when the whole population of the Philippines was reclassified into four according to tax payment or tribute. These classes are the Spaniards and Spanish mestizos, Indios, Chinese, and Chinese mestizos. Spaniards and Spanish mestizos were not required to pay tribute or tax, whereas the three other classes were required to pay taxes depending on their income. At the end of the 19th century, there were almost 500,000 Chinese mestizos in the Philippines, with 46,000 living in Manila. A Chinese mestizo then was any person born of a Chinese father and Indian mother, a Spanish mestiza who married a Chinese mestizo, or a child of Spanish mestiza and a Chinese mestizo. However, a Chinese mestiza and an Indio were listed as Indios.
Significance of the Chinese mestizos. The explosion of Chinese immigrants in the Philippines enabled the Chinese mestizos to take over the markets that the former previously controlled. Chinese mestizos become prominent and influential figures in the area of industry, commerce, and business during the Spanish colonial period. They carried on the lucrative commerce by collecting goods from the north and selling them to the Manila and nearby provinces. They monopolized the internal trading in the Philippines, while the Spanish mestizos were concerned with foreign trade. The entrepreneurial power of Chinese mestizos gave way to the emergence of the Philippine middle class, described as more active and inspiring, more prudent and pioneering, more oriented to trade and commerce than the indigenous. Boring 1963. Aside from contributing to economic establishing, another significant role that Chinese mestizos played in the Philippine society was the formation of the Philippine identity. This was evident during the latter part of the 19th century when they became clearly influential in the campaign of the Philippines as a Spanish colony. This caused the Spaniards to be concerned with the ability of the Chinese mestizos to cause discord in society. By 18th, Chinese mestizos in the province began to form opinions regarding the Spanish colonial rule. It was also difficult to separate the indigenous from the Chinese mestizos since they identified themselves with each other's society and culturally. Chinese mestizos shared grievances with the indigenous about the harassed conditions under the Spanish rule. Spaniards figured that the identity-dependent mindset and the liberalism of Chinese mestizos might influence the political consciousness of Indians.
The recorded history of the Philippines would be incomplete as a basis for understanding contemporary society unless it takes into account the Chinese mestizos' contribution to our development as a nation. The Chinese mestizos were an important element of the Philippine society in 19th century. They played a significant role in the formation of the Filipino middle class, in the agitation for reforms in the 1898 revolution, and in the formation of what is now known as the Filipino nationality. In contemporary times, their role in nation building continues. In addition, the significant role of the Chinese mestizos in the making of the nation was highly evident at the turn of the century. Their involvement in the armed revolt against the colonizer shows that they recognized Spain as the enemy, the oppressor. The Philippine Revolution of 1896 to 1898 was the act of determination on the part of Filipinos, Indios, and Chinese mestizos alike to claim for themselves and for future generations the incomparable right of nationhood.
Rizal and the Chinese Mestizos. Rizal is a fifth generation Chinese Mestizo. However, he and his father were considered as Indios. Some documents and scholarly papers noted that Rizal disliked being called Chinese Mestizo or Chinoy, and he dissociated himself from any Chinese relations. Through his novels No Limitang Here and El Filibusterismo, Rizal exposed the abuses and corruption of the Spanish authorities, condemned the oppression of the people by the colonizers, and ridiculed the hypocrisy and overbearing attitude of the Spanish friars. He also depicted the bloody revolution that sparked people's fury and eventually led them to revolt. At the same time, as a sign of his contempt towards Chinese immigrants in the Philippines, his novels brimmed with insults and scorn for them. Rizal clearly manifested his anti-Chinese feelings in his writings, as well as in his correspondence with family and friends. By virtue of his lineage, Rizal could have had a special connection with the Chinese, but such was not the case. The concern on whether Rizal's disdain over his Chinese lineage made him less of a hero is not something to argue about. Chinese Mestizo or not, Rizal is a nationalist and a Filipino.
Section 2. Family, Childhood, and Early Education of Rizal. This section presents the background of Rizal's life, his family, and his childhood years in Calamba.
Family of Jose Rizal. Jose Rizal was born to a wealthy family in Calamba, Laguna. His parents, Francisco Mercado Rizal and Eudora Alonzo Realonda, was a prosperous farmers who were granted lease of a hacienda and an accompanying rice farm by the Dominicans. He was the seventh among the 11 children of Francisco Mercado Rizal and Eudora Alonzo Realonda. Paciano, the second to the eldest child in the family, was the only brother of Jose. His other siblings were Saturnina, Narcisa, Olympia, Lucia, Maria, Concepcion, Josefa, Trinidad, and Soledad. Jose had a Chinese ancestor from his father's side, Domingo Lamco, who married a Chinese mestiza, Ines de la Rosa. Aside from his Chinese ancestry, he also had Spanish, Japanese, and Malay blood. In 1849, then Governor General of the Philippines, Narciso Claveria, issued a decree by which native Filipino and immigrant families were to adopt Spanish surnames from a list of Spanish family names. Although the Chino mestizos were allowed to hold on to their Chinese surnames, Lamco changed his surnames to the Spanish Mercado, which means market, possibly to indicate their Chinese merchant roots. Jose's father, Francisco, adopted the surname Rizal, which was suggested to him by a provincial governor, or as Jose had described him, a friend of the family. However, the name change caused confusion in the business affairs of Francisco, most of which were begun under the old name. After a few years, he settled on the name Rizal Mercado as a compromise, but usually just used the original surname Mercado. Childhood of Jose Rizal. At an early age, Jose was already seen as a welcome companion by many adults because he was very respectful and polite. Jose's parents made sure he and his siblings were well taken care of. His family made sure that he was taught the right values in order for him to grow up as a well-mannered individual. At home, Rizal spent many of his childhood days in their family garden. His parents also made sure to watch over him at all times because he was frail and sickly. His father also built him a nipa hut where he could play during the day. In his childhood, Jose was very curious about the things around him. This is why he enjoyed very much the stories that his mother told him, which also made him interested in legends and folklore. Jose Rizal's education started at home with his mom and aunt as his first teachers. His early studies also started with his teacher, Justina Aquino Cruz. He learned the alphabet from his mother at the age of 3 and could read and write at the age of 5. Since the Rizal family was very religious, Theodora made sure to teach Jose Rizal an important prayer, especially the Angelus. Along with his siblings and parents, he recited the Angelus daily. Through his family, he was exposed to Catholic teachings and values.
Teodora Alonzo Realonda was Rizal's mother and his very first teacher. He wrote to one of his journals, "My mother taught me how to read and how to say haltingly the humble prayers which I raise fervently to God." At the age of 3, he was able to recite alphabet with the help of his mother. She later discovered Rizal's talent for poetry and encouraged him to write. Rizal's parents employed private tutors to give him lessons at home. The first was Maestro Celestino and followed by Maestro Lucas Padua. Later, an old man named Leon Monroy, who was his father's former classmate, became Rizal's tutor who taught him rudiments of Latin. His uncle Manuel Alberto covered Rizal's physical development and instilled his love for nature, and his uncle Gregorio taught him the value of education. Jose Rizal had his early education in Calamba and Biñan, which focused on reading, writing, arithmetic, and religion. Instructions there were imposed rigidly and strictly. Teachers forced knowledge to the minds of the students by using whips. But despite the shortcomings of the basic education system of the Spaniards, Rizal was able to acquire necessary skills that prepared him for higher education in Manila. In June 1869, Rizal went to Biñan, Laguna and studied under his first teacher, Maestro Justiniano Aquino Cruz, while attending the private school of Biñan. Jose Rizal was responsible for his work and dedicated to his religion. He regularly attended Mass, went to the orchard, went to class at 10 a.m. and ate lunch, arrived home at 5 p.m. and constantly studied and drew and consistently prayed before going to bed. In terms of his academic studies and performance, he beat all the Biñan boys and surpassed them in Spanish, Latin, and other subjects. His classmates were so jealous of Rizal's intellectual superiority that they constantly reported to the teacher whenever Rizal had fights outside of school, and even told lies to discredit him. As a result, the teacher had to punish him and he received many whippings and strokes. Although he was not quarrelsome, Rizal never backed out from a fight. And despite these events from his early education, Rizal was able to successfully get higher education and degree later on.
Let us now talk about how Rizal was influenced during his childhood that molded him to become what he is in his life. We can deny the fact that the ideas of Rizal were the results of many influences to his life, through his parents, uncles, sisters, Pasyana, and ancestors. Through his mother, Teodora, he gained to become religious, self-sacrifice, and love for the arts. To his father, he cultivated the value of self-respect, passionate about work and independent thinking. Pasyana influenced Rizal to love his country and to seek for justice, while his sisters taught him to be respectful to every woman. Moreover, his uncles embodied him to develop his skills in art like sculpting, painting, and sketching. Of all the persons who had the greatest influence on Rizal's development as a person was his mother, Teodora Alonso. It was she who opened his eyes and heart to the world around him, with all its soul and poetry, as well as its bigotry and injustice. Above all, it was from her he learned about obedience, through the story of the moth that got burned by the flame because he disobeyed his mother moth's warning not to get too near the flame.
Section 3. Agrarian Relations at the Friar lands. This section provides a short history of the dynamics of the land ownership in the Philippines during Rizal's time. It discusses the Hacienda system in connection with the existence of friar lands. Specifically, it mentions conflicts arising from the Hacienda system and shows their impacts on Philippine society and on the family of Rizal as Inquilinos.
The definition of the Inquilino: a worker of a Chilean landed estate who is usually given the use of small plot of land, implements, seed, and small wage in return of his labor. They say that the Spanish friars are able to acquire and mostly everything, since people back then are trading their assets to the friars just to obtain spiritual favors. The inquilinato system functioned as a three-layered system with a landlord, inquilinos, and kasama.
The presence of the prior lands in the Philippines may be traced back to the early Spanish colonial period, when Spanish conquistadors were given lands in the form of haciendas in exchange of their devotion to the Spanish crown.
So, around 120 Spaniards were granted or given either tracts of land called Sitio de Ganado Mayor or smaller tracts called caballeras. So, hacienderos or haciendera owners were unable to develop their estates due to the following factors. First is Spaniards were not anticipated to stay in the Philippines permanently because many of them returned home after serving the country. So at that time, the livestock market was still modest or small. As a result, the Spaniards preferred the Manila-based galleon trade because it provided superior economic opportunities.
Hacienda de Calamba was sold to the two people named Don Manuel Jorigu and Don Clemente de Azanza because it was originally owned by a Spaniard who donated the land to Jesuit. After the death of Don Clemente de Azanza, it was eventually sold to the Dominicans. Family of Rizal had migrated to the Hacienda in search of economic opportunities that eventually became one of the principal inquilinos in the Hacienda. Rizal's family rented one of the largest area lands, measuring approximately 380 hectares. Sugarcane was the main crop because it was the most in demand in the world market. The conflicts in land ownership in the Hacienda arose in the 1883 when the tenants failed to pay their rent. To make the story short, the conflict rose from the continued unreasonable increase of rentals, land confiscation, and other exploitative practices of the Hacienda management. This caused financial hardships to the tenants and worsened by the other factors such as poor harvest, crops destroyed by unbearable weather, and pestilence. Hacienda de Calamba became a site of agitation in the late 1990s. It was all started by the findings of Rizal on the land ownership of the Friars. It was shocking that there was only a little land owned by the Friars, but their possession of the remaining land was unlawful.